Chapter 1. The Trade. Some stories begin with a choice. This one begins with the absence of one. The rain had been falling since morning. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, that simply arrives and stays, gray and patient and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. It streaked the high windows of Thornveil Pack Hall in long, wavering lines, and it turned the stone courtyard outside into a mirror that reflected nothing flattering. Lyra Voss stood in the center of that hall and did not move. She had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor, that if you held yourself quietly enough, spine straight, hands loose at your sides, face arranged into something that could be called composure, people could not be entirely certain they had broken. They suspected, but they could not be sure. And in a world that ran on dominance and the reading of weakness, that uncertainty was the only currency she had left. There were 40 wolves in that hall. Not one of them was looking at her. They were looking at Wren. He stood at the front of the room with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment and found it satisfying. Tall, dark-haired, handsome in the particular way of men who have always been told so. The kind of handsome that eventually reveals itself as a mask worn so long it has forgotten. There's a face beneath it. He held a single sheet of paper, though she suspected he had memorized the words on it long before today. Beside him, in the carved oak chair reserved for witness testimony, sat his new mate, a woman named Calla, with pale hands folded in her lap and a carefully arranged expression that Lyra recognized because she was wearing one too. The difference was that Calla's blankness was comfort, Lyra's was survival. Wren began to speak. His voice was measured, regretful even. He had practiced that too. He spoke of the evening 3 weeks prior, when a senior pack elder had fallen gravely ill after the communal dinner. He spoke of the investigation that followed. He spoke, with great and performative sorrow, of the evidence that had been found. Evidence that pointed, he said, and here his gaze moved to Lyra for the first and only time, briefly, like a man acknowledging an unpleasant but necessary fact. To her, poison, administered through the elder's evening tea. The elder had recovered. That was not the point. The point, Wren explained, was the intent, the betrayal, the danger that a wolf of that character posed to the stability of the pack. Lyra listened to all of it. She did not cry. She had known, the moment she was summoned to this hall, what was happening. She had spent the night before sitting on the edge of her bed, going through every version of this scenario. Every argument she could make, every truth she could present, every witness she could call, and she had arrived by dawn at the same conclusion every time. It didn't matter. It had never mattered. This wasn't a trial. It was a reading. The verdict had been written before she walked through the door, and the only question was how she would receive it. So she listened. She stood still. She did not give them her tears. When Wren finished, a murmur moved through the room. Not shocked, she noted, confirming. These wolves had been prepared for this moment. The narrative had been circulating for days, passed from mouth to ear, in corridors and kitchens and training yards, shaped and smoothed until it felt like something everyone had arrived at, independently. She had underestimated how long he had been planning this. That more than anything was what hurt. Then her father spoke. Alpha Aldrich Voss was a large man, broad through the chest, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who has held power long enough that he no longer needs to perform it. He rose from his seat at the head of the room's long table, and he looked at Lyra with gray eyes that had, when she was small, felt like the safest thing in the world. They did not feel that way now. He did not say she was innocent. She had held, until that moment, a small and stubborn hope that he would. that something, fatherhood, perhaps, or memory, or the simple fact of knowing his own daughter, would be stronger than strategy. It was not. He spoke instead of stability, of the pack's welfare which required difficult decisions, of an opportunity that had presented itself, an alliance with Thornveil Pack, long sought, now achievable. He spoke of the arrangement that had been made, a political marriage, a peace offering extended in good faith. He spoke of her as if she were a letter he was forwarding to a new address. She would leave in the morning, he said. A representative of Thornveil would escort her. The alliance would be confirmed upon her arrival. He sat back down, and that was the end of it. Lyra walked out of that hall under her own power. She chose the pace, unhurried, deliberate, her boots quiet on the stone floor. She looked at no one. She looked straight ahead at the great oak doors, and she pushed through them into the rain, and she kept walking until she was in the corridor beyond. And the doors had closed behind her, and the sound of 40 wolves murmuring in agreement was muffled to nothing. Then she stopped. She put one hand against the cold stone wall, and she breathed, just breathed, in and out, the way Marin had taught her years ago during a different crisis, a smaller one. Count the breath in, count the breath out. The world is still the same size it was a moment ago. You are still the same size, she counted. After a while, the world did feel approximately the same size. She straightened, removed her hand from the wall, and went to pack. She took 2 bags. The act of choosing what mattered was both simpler and more devastating than she expected. Clothes, practical ones, worn ones, the ones that felt like herself. Books, the photograph of Marin and her from the summer 5 years ago, before everything. Her mother's journal, which she had never been able to read but also never been able to leave behind. Her mother's ring she left on the dresser. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. The thin gold band, the small amber stone that had always caught light in a particular way. It had been given to her. It had felt for years like something she owned. She left it, not out of sentiment, not as a statement. She left it because she refused to carry anything out of this place that could be called a gift. Marin came in while she was closing the second bag. Her sister was 21 and incapable of hiding what she felt, which meant that her face, in this moment, was doing a great deal of things simultaneously. She sat on the bed. She looked at the bags. She looked at Lyra. She opened her mouth twice and closed it again. "I know," Lyra said. "I wasn't going to say anything. I know." Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and covered Lyra's hand with hers. Just that. Nothing else. No words, because they were sisters, and they had always known when words were the wrong instrument. They sat like that for a while the rain continued against the window, indifferent and patient, and thoroughly unbothered by the Voss family's circumstances. The drive to Thornveil took 3 hours. The escort was 2 wolves she didn't know. Professional, silent, the kind of men who had learned that being unreadable was the same as being useful. They drove a dark vehicle on roads that got narrower as they went north, and Lyra sat in the back and watched the landscape change. It was subtle at first. Then it wasn't. The trees got older. That was the only way she could describe it. Older, heavier, denser, as if they had been growing since before the roads existed, and had simply accommodated the asphalt as a minor inconvenience. The canopy closed overhead. The light shifted from gray afternoon to something deeper and more deliberate. Through the cracked window, the air changed. She noticed it without wanting to, a quality to the scent of this place that was different from Ashvale. Wilder, she thought, less managed, like a territory that had been allowed to remain what it actually was, rather than shaped into what someone wanted it to be. She told herself the tightening sensation in her chest was dread. She was fairly certain she was lying to herself. After a time, the trees opened, and Thornveil Manor appeared at the end of a long stone drive. And it was not what she had pictured. She had built an image in her mind over the past 24 hours. Something cold. Something designed to intimidate. A display of alpha power made architectural. All hard lines and silence, and the pointed absence of warmth. What she saw instead was a building that had simply been here for a very long time. Stone walls darkened by decades of weather. Old ivy climbing the north face, windows that were tall and numerous. And every single one of them lit from within. Warm light pressing against the rain-dark glass. The kind of light that suggested fires inside. The kind of light that suggested someone had prepared for an arrival. She stepped out of the car into the rain, and at the top of the entrance steps, very still and very dark against the lit doorway, was a man. He was not what she had pictured either. She had expected performance. Coldness as a statement. Arms crossed, jaw set, the visual grammar of authority being established. What she saw instead was a man who simply stood. No performance in him at all. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark wool that the rain was beginning to dot with moisture. And he looked at her with green eyes that were. She registered this before she registered anything else, not hostile, not warm either, not anything she had a clean word for. He did not come down the steps to meet her. He waited for her to come to him, which was either alpha dominance or something more complicated, and she didn't have the data to determine which. She climbed the steps. She introduced herself. Her name, her pack of origin, a sentence of formal greeting that had been prepared for her like a script she'd been handed and not rehearsed. She delivered it adequately. He said her name back, just her name, once, quietly, Lyra, not as acknowledgement, not as greeting, as something else. Something private, almost like a man confirming something to himself that he had been uncertain of until now. She didn't know what to do with that. She went inside. Dinner was at a long table in a room, with high ceilings and a fireplace that could have parked a small vehicle. 2 place settings, not at opposite ends. That, she thought, would have been a different kind of statement. Midway down the table. Close enough to speak without effort. Not close enough to be presumptuous. Someone had thought about this. She wasn't certain if that made her more comfortable or less. The food was simple. Roasted vegetables, bread that was clearly fresh, something warm and substantial that she recognized as the cooking of someone who had learned in a practical kitchen rather than a performative one. It was good. She ate it. She noticed halfway through the meal that she was genuinely hungry for the first time in 2 days. He ate across from her and did not make conversation. She had expected questions. Who are you? What do you want? What will you do here? She had prepared answers, deflections, the careful minimal truths of a woman who has learned that information is a resource best conserved. She had been ready for this to be an interview. It wasn't. He ate. He was quiet. The fire was loud. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked time in deep, even intervals. She decided after a few minutes that she wasn't going to make conversation either. They were halfway through the meal before she realized that the silence wasn't hostile. It simply was. 2 people eating in the same room, neither of them performing for the other. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been in a room with someone and not felt the social machinery running, the reading, and being read, the constant low hum of managing how you were perceived. Here there was just the fire and the food and the quiet and the rain. She looked up from her plate. I won't pretend, she said. I want you to know that from the beginning. Whatever this arrangement is, whatever role you've been told I'll play, I won't perform it. I'm here because I had no other choice. I want you to understand that." She had meant it as a boundary, a defensive position established early. He set down his fork. He looked at her. That same steady, unhurried look from the steps, like a man with all the time in the world and no particular anxiety about how it was spent. "I'm not asking you to pretend anything," he said. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating. She sat with that for the rest of the meal, turned it over, examined it for the catch, searched it for the subtext she was certain must be there. She didn't find one. Her room was on the second floor, east wing, which she had noted was not the sealed east wing, a detail she filed for later. The fireplace was already burning when she arrived. The bed had been turned down. On the small table by the window, a glass of water, and a single candle that had been lit recently, enough that the wax was still fresh. She sat on the edge of the bed. The house was quiet around her in the way that large old houses are quiet. Not empty, but settled, like a place that has absorbed enough living to have developed a personality of its own, and has decided that this particular evening it was going to be still. She thought about the escort wolves driving back to Ashvale in the rain. She thought about her sister sitting alone in a room that no longer had both of them in it. She thought about a ring on a dresser that she had left because she'd been too proud and too tired and too done to carry it. She thought about a man who had said, "I'm not asking you to pretend anything," and had seemed to mean it simply, without agenda, without performance. She did not trust the feeling that moved through her then. It was quiet and warm and entirely unwelcome. It felt in the most inconvenient and bewildering way, like the beginning of something safe. She didn't trust it. But sitting in the firelight with the rain still falling outside, and the house breathing slowly around her, she found, despite everything, that she could not make it stop. She lay down, she closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, sleep came quickly. Chapter 2. What? He doesn't say. She woke to silence and the smell of coffee, not the silence of an empty house. She had grown up in a pack hall large enough to swallow sound whole, and she knew the particular quality of emptiness, the way it pressed against the ears like held breath. This was different. This was the silence of a house that had people in it who simply weren't making noise. Occupied silence. The kind that has weight and texture, and, she noticed this without wanting to, a certain quality of consideration, as if the quiet had been deliberately maintained for someone still sleeping. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. The room cooler now, but not cold. The gray morning light coming through the curtains, with the muted patience of a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. Outside, somewhere below the window, a bird called twice and stopped. Somewhere further, the low sound of wind moving through old trees, she thought. I am in a stranger's house, she thought. I slept better than I have in months. She did not examine that second thought too closely. The coffee was in the kitchen, a large pot of it, kept warm on the stove, already made. No note beside it, no instruction. It was simply there, the way the lit fireplace had been simply there. And the turned-down bed and the fresh candle. As if someone in this house had developed the habit of anticipating what a person might need and providing it without requiring acknowledgement. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the territory. In daylight, Thornveil looked different than it had the night before. The grounds were expansive, old lawns gone deliberately wild at the edges, giving way to the tree line that began perhaps 200 meters from the house and continued as far as she could tell, indefinitely. The forest was the kind that didn't apologize for itself. Dense and dark and certain of its own nature, with paths worn into it by years of wolf traffic that wound out of sight almost immediately. A hawk crossed the sky above the furthest tree line. Nothing else moved. He's gone already, she thought. And then she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not his, lighter and more deliberate. The footsteps of someone choosing to announce themselves. And a man appeared in the kitchen doorway, who was not Calder Ashwood. He was younger, leaner, with sandy brown hair that looked like it had been pushed back once this morning, and then forgotten about, and pale gray eyes that were taking in the sight of her standing in the kitchen with his Alpha's coffee in her hand, with an expression she could only describe as entertained. "Devlin Cross," he said, by way of introduction. He leaned against the doorframe with the ease of someone who had been leaning against that particular doorframe for years. Second in command, unofficial keeper of schedules, and the only person in this pack who will tell you when you have something in your teeth. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Do I? No, but it's good to know you can take a joke." He pushed off the doorframe and moved to the stove with the familiarity of a man in his own kitchen, which she suspected this essentially was. He's out in the territory. East boundary. He's there most mornings before the sun is fully up. Doesn't sleep past 4. Never has, which I consider a character flaw but have learned to accommodate. Does he know you tell people his habits? He knows I tell people what's useful. Devlin poured his own coffee and turned to face her, leaning back against the counter with his ankles crossed, relaxed in the way of someone whose default setting was observation. He also knows that if you're going to live here, you'll figure it out eventually. He'd rather you know things early than feel like you're navigating blind. She considered that. He told you that? He didn't have to. She drank her coffee and said nothing, and decided she had just received her first piece of genuinely useful information about Calder Ashwood, which was that the people who served him did so by reading him rather than being directed by him. That spoke to a particular kind of authority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. "What should I know?" she asked. "About being here, what he expects." Devlin tilted his head slightly. "He doesn't, actually." "Doesn't what?" "Expect. He's, very deliberately, not expecting anything from you." He said it without irony, which meant he meant it. The house is yours to move through. The library, the grounds within the inner boundary, the kitchen. If you want something, ask someone. There's staff. They come in mornings and leave by early evening. They're not pack, but they know the situation and they're discreet. If you want to be left alone, you will be. A pause. He's not going to make this harder than it already is. She looked at him for a moment. "Is that something he told you?" Devlin smiled, small and sideways and private. The smile of someone who finds the world consistently more interesting than people expect. "That one," he said, "he actually did." She spent the morning alone. This was, she decided, a deliberate choice, not avoidance, but assessment. She was in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar rules, and she had learned long ago that the most efficient way to understand a new environment was to move through it without agenda, to let it show her what it was before she decided what she thought of it. So she moved through it. The manor was larger than it appeared from outside, not in a labyrinthine way, not in the way of houses designed to confuse or impress, but in the way of a building that had been added to over many decades by people who needed more room and simply built it without worrying too much about whether it made architectural sense. The result was a house with personality, corridors that turned unexpectedly into small reading alcoves, a staircase that split at the landing and offered two routes to the same upper hallway, a room at the back of the ground floor that seemed to serve no clear purpose except to contain an extremely old armchair, a floor lamp with a warm bulb, and a view of the garden that was, objectively, the best in the house. She stood in that room for a while. She stood in the library longer. The library was 2 stories, which she hadn't expected, accessible by a narrow iron staircase in the corner that spiraled up to a mezzanine level lined with shelves. The books were not decorative. They were used, many of them, with the worn spines and occasionally broken bindings of things that had been read repeatedly and returned to shelves without much ceremony. History, primarily. Territorial law, some natural science, a section of what appeared to be architectural texts. Fiction, scattered and unsystematic, not a curated collection, but an accumulated one. The kind that grows over years from actual reading, rather than from wanting to appear like someone who reads. On the lower level, near the fireplace, was a chessboard. It sat on a small square table between 2 chairs, both chairs showing the particular wear of regular use, and it was mid-game, pieces in positions that suggested not a casual game, but a considered one. Black, having the stronger position, white wolf compensated with a knight sacrifice that was either a genuine strategy or a mistake she couldn't read from where she stood. She crouched down and looked at the board. There was no second player. That was clear from the positioning of the chairs. One was angled slightly further from the table, the way you'd angle a chair if you were sitting back to consider both sides of a board. There were not 2 cups of cold tea or 2 sets of fingerprints worn into the table's edge. There was one. He played alone. He played chess alone in his own library, alternating sides, playing against himself. She stood up and looked at the board for another moment. Then she went to find the room with the best view of the garden and sat in the old armchair and read until she heard the front door. He came back mid-morning, which Devlin had implied was early for him. She heard the front door, heavy, old. It had a specific sound, and then the kitchen, and then quiet, and then nothing for a while. She didn't move from her chair. She was reading. She was also, if she was honest with herself, aware of the geography of his movements through the house the way you become aware of weather. Not focused on it, but tracking it peripherally, some animal part of the brain conducting its own quiet assessment of the environment. After 20 minutes or so, she got hungry and went to the kitchen. He was there. He was standing at the counter, doing something with the contents of the refrigerator that appeared to be the early stages of lunch. Ingredients pulled out and set aside with the systematic efficiency of someone who has been feeding themselves for a long time and has no patience for drama about it. He was still in his outdoor clothes, the dark wool damp at the shoulders from the morning, hair slightly wind-disordered in a way she suspected he hadn't noticed. He looked up when she came in. She went to the counter on the opposite side of the kitchen and found bread and began making something simple without asking permission. There was no reason to ask permission. The kitchen had been explicitly offered to her. She wasn't going to perform uncertainty she didn't feel. He watched her for a moment. Then he went back to what he was doing. They occupied the kitchen for, she counted afterward, because she felt the need to make sense of it, 23 minutes. He made a grain salad of some complexity. She made a sandwich. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them, she noticed, did that thing that people do in close quarters with strangers. That particular overcompensation of elaborately not looking at each other. The exaggerated absorption in a task to demonstrate that you are absolutely not thinking about the other person's presence. He simply moved through the kitchen the way he moved through everything, economically, without announcement. And she moved through it the same way. And they arrived at a lunch that each of them had made independently, and then ate at the same table in the same room the same way they had eaten dinner the night before, in quiet, without performance. She noticed something during those 23 minutes. He always knew where she was in the room without looking. She tested it, moved from the counter to the table to the window to retrieve a cloth. And he never looked up, but his body adjusted. Slight repositioning. Always a clear path between himself and the door. Always an angle that placed him, without apparent deliberation, between her and the room's entrance. He wasn't doing it consciously. She was almost certain of that. It was instinct, deep, habituated, wolf-boned. The positioning of a creature who had decided below the level of thought that something in this room was worth orienting himself around. She wasn't certain whether to be unsettled by that or something else entirely. She ate her sandwich and decided not to decide. After lunch, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Not blocking it, just pausing, the way someone does when they're about to say something they've been considering for a while. The inner boundary, he said. I'll show you where it ends. It was not phrased as an invitation. It was information. Here is a thing that exists. Here is where you can find it. Delivered without the social softening of would you like or if you want. She thought briefly about declining, about the assertiveness of saying she'd find it on her own, about the independence of not accepting anything from this situation that looked like accommodation. She got her coat. They walked for 40 minutes. He set a pace that matched hers without adjustment, not slowing down for her, not outpacing her, simply moving at the same speed she moved, the way you do when you're walking with someone whose company you're already calibrated to. She noticed this without commenting on it. He pointed out the boundary markers, old stone cairns at intervals, worn smooth by weather and decades. He told her the inner boundary was not a restriction. She was free to go beyond it if she chose. The outer boundary, 3 kilometers further, was wolf-marked territory, and she should know it by scent before she crossed it alone. You're telling me I can leave, she said. I'm telling you where, he said. On the way back, on an impulse she didn't entirely plan, she gestured toward the sealed east wing visible from the path. The windows covered, the entrance grown over, with ivy more dense than the rest of the building. Why is that wing sealed? A pause. Not uncomfortable, thoughtful. The pause of someone choosing a true answer over a deflecting one. It isn't ready, he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the wing. His jaw had that particular quality of stillness that she was already after less than 24 hours. Beginning to read as meaning that something was happening beneath the surface, that he wasn't surfacing. She didn't ask what it wasn't ready for. She had the distinct sense that the answer was there, in the way he looked at those covered windows. If she was patient enough to wait for it, she was, she thought, a patient woman. They walked back in quiet. She found him in the library that evening. He was in one of the 2 chairs beside the chessboard, and the board had been reset, not to its mid-game position, but to the beginning. All pieces in their starting places, black and white in their respective ranks, the board clean and ready. He was sitting with a book, but he wasn't reading. The book was open on his knee, and his eyes were on the fire. She sat down in the other chair. It was a deliberate act, and she let it be deliberate. She did not make it casual, did not pretend she had simply happened to end up there. She sat, and she looked at the board, and she said, "Who do you play against?" "No one," he said. You play alone. Yes. She studied the opening positions. That's, she considered, either very lonely or very disciplined. Possibly both. He looked at her then. A glance, brief and sideways, with something in it she couldn't fully name. The edge of something that might have been humor in someone who had more practice with it. Both, he agreed. She picked up a white pawn. She looked at him. She set it down 2 squares forward. A silence followed. Long enough that she thought he might simply return to his not reading. Then he set the book aside. He reached across and moved a black pawn. They played for 2 hours. She won the first game by a margin that surprised both of them. She was a solid player, not exceptional. But she had the advantage of playing an opponent who had been splitting his concentration between 2 sides for so long that he had developed a kind of strategic overcorrection, always anticipating the threat, never quite committing to the offense. She exploited that. She won without crowing about it, which she suspected was the right call. He won the second game with a ruthlessness that told her the first game had recalibrated him. He learned very quickly. She filed that away. They spoke only of moves. Knight to f3, bishop takes, check, the specific contained language of a game that requires precision and permits no small talk. It was, she thought, pressing her lips together against the almost smile, the best conversation she'd had in months, possibly longer. When the second game ended, she sat back in the chair, and the fire was lower than it had been, and the house around them had settled into its late evening quiet, and neither of them said anything about stopping, but neither of them moved to reset the board either. After a while she stood. "Good night," she said. He looked up from the board. "Good night," he said. Just that. Simple. Like a man who had been sitting in his own library on an ordinary evening and happened to have company. She went down the hallway to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the house. Somewhere down the corridor, not far, not close, at the comfortable middle distance of someone who was present but not intrusive, she heard him settle. The particular quiet that follows movement, the quality of stillness that means someone is awake and not sleeping, and not intending to disturb you and not going anywhere either. He was awake. She was awake. 2 people at either end of the same corridor, not speaking, not sleeping, occupying the nighttime hours of the same house with the specific awareness of someone else's wakefulness. She had been in this house for less than 48 hours. She already knew the sound of him being awake. She lay there and thought about that. What it meant that she already knew it, that she had catalogued it without choosing to. That some part of her had been paying attention to him with a precision she usually reserved for things that mattered. She thought, that should frighten me. She thought, it doesn't. And then, before she could decide what to do with that, she was asleep, faster than she'd fallen asleep in years, easy and deep and dreamless. In a stranger's house, in a stranger's corridor with a stranger's wakefulness keeping quiet time in the dark. Chapter 3. Snowbound. The news came at breakfast. Devlin appeared in the kitchen doorway, with the particular energy of someone who had already been awake for several hours, managing things that other people hadn't woken up to yet. And he delivered it the way he delivered most things, directly, without preamble, with the faint undertone of a man who found the timing of the universe privately amusing. A territorial dispute, the Northern Pass. A rival pack faction had moved 3 enforcers into land that had been Thornveil's by treaty for 11 years, and the kind of message that required a physical presence to send properly. Not aggression, just authority. The body language of a territory reminding its neighbors of its dimensions. Calder would need to leave within the hour. Protocol. Devlin explained, looking not at Calder, but at Lyra, which told her the explanation was for her benefit. Required that when the Alpha traveled to disputed territory, someone representing Thornveil's domestic stability accompanied him. A second presence, evidence of a pack that was settled, rooted, not rattled by border games. His alliance partner, he said, satisfied that protocol in ways that required no additional explanation to watching packs, he said. Alliance partner, the way someone says a word they have chosen very carefully. Lyra looked at her coffee. She had exactly the wrong amount of time to think about it. Long enough to build an objection, not long enough to build a good one. She could refuse. She was free to refuse. Devlin had essentially just confirmed that her presence in this arrangement came without compulsion, that she was being asked rather than instructed. She looked up. Calder was watching her from across the table, with those steady green eyes, and the expression she was beginning to identify as his version of patience, which was not the soft, accommodating patience of someone waiting for you to feel comfortable, but the absolute, unmoving patience of something that has decided to wait and intends to do so indefinitely. He was not pressuring her. He was simply present, waiting to see what she would do. She set down her coffee. How long, she asked. 3 days, Devlin said. Possibly 2, if the weather cooperates. She looked at the window. The sky outside had the particular flat gray of a sky with something to say. And the weather, she said, is not going to cooperate. The weather, Devlin agreed pleasantly, is absolutely not going to cooperate. She went to pack her smaller bag. The lodge was an hour north of the manor, on a road that became progressively less interested in being a road as they went. It sat at the edge of the tree line where the territory's inner boundary met the beginning of the disputed pass. Old stone walls, low-beamed ceilings, a central fireplace with a hearth the size of a dining table, functional, honest. The kind of building that had been built by someone who needed shelter rather than someone who needed to be seen providing it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. One main room, a kitchen alcove along the far wall, 2 sleeping areas separated by a heavy curtain partition, a table, 2 chairs by the fire, a window on the north wall that faced the tree line, and beyond the tree line, the dark ridge line of the disputed pass. It was smaller than her bedroom at Ashvale, she thought. 3 days, she thought. Possibly 2 if the weather cooperates. She looked at the sky through the north window and thought, at least 4. The storm arrived 2 hours after they did, which gave Calder just enough time to make his presence known at the boundary. A slow, unhurried walk along the tree line in his wolf form that she watched from the lodge window, and that clearly communicated everything it needed to. Because by the time he came back inside and the first real snow began falling, the rival pack's enforcers had withdrawn to the other side of the ridge. She didn't ask how she knew this. She just knew it. The territory had a feeling when it was holding something tense, and it had a different feeling when that thing resolved. He came in from the cold, and she handed him a cup of something hot, without commentary, and he took it without commentary, and they stood at the north window together and watched the snow begin in earnest. Slow at first, then committed, then total. The world outside narrowing to white and the dark shapes of the nearest trees, and then just white. 4 days, she said. He looked at the snow. 3, he said. She looked at the snow. 4. A pause, the faintest exhale through his nose. Possibly 4, he conceded. He cooked dinner. This was the first thing that surprised her. Not that he could cook. She'd already seen an evidence of that at the manor, but the manner of it. Unhurried. Systematic. He moved through the lodge's small kitchen, the way he moved through everything, with an economy of motion that somehow managed to produce results without appearing to hurry toward them. He did not ask if she was hungry. He did not announce what he was making. He simply began making it, and she sat at the table and watched, and at some point she picked up a knife and began chopping vegetables without being asked, and he made room for her at the counter, without comment. They made dinner together in a kitchen the size of a generous closet, and did not speak, and it was. She searched for the accurate word, and arrived at one she immediately distrusted. Easy. It was easy. She did not examine that. After dinner, she explored the lodge's shelves, while he handled the boundary communication relay at the edge of the property. A brief, cold trip she watched through the window, his silhouette dark against the white of the snow, the relay equipment older than anything she'd expected a pack this powerful to still be using. The shelves held a variety of things with no apparent organizational system. Spare equipment, maps of the territory, 2 decks of cards, a collection of worn paperbacks that had no thematic coherence whatsoever. History, some fiction, a guide to northern tree species that had been read so often the spine had separated, and one slim volume of poetry tucked between a territorial law text and a decade-old almanac that she pulled out and looked at and put back before he came inside. When she settled into her chair by the fire later that evening, the poetry collection was on the table beside her. She looked at it for a moment. She looked toward the kitchen where he was cleaning up with his back to her. She picked it up and opened it and did not say anything about it. And he did not say anything about it. And the fire was warm, and the snow pressed against the windows, and they spent the evening in the same room reading separately and together, in a silence that had stopped feeling like the absence of something and started feeling like a thing in itself. She asked him about the territorial dispute while the fire was burning low, and both of them were in that comfortable, late evening state of having read too long. Not as small talk. She did not do small talk, had never seen much purpose in it. She asked, because she had been dropped into a political situation she didn't understand, and she was not the kind of woman who tolerated not understanding things she was living inside of. He answered without condescension. He explained the history of the Northern Pass, the original treaty, the faction that had emerged from the neighboring pack after a contested leadership succession, the territorial ambiguity that faction was deliberately exploiting. He used terms she knew, and when he used ones she didn't, he defined them without pausing, without drawing attention to the definition, in the seamless way of someone who is actually explaining, rather than performing the act of explanation. She listened, she thought, and then she said, "The faction's alpha, he's not actually interested in the pass." Calder paused. "The pass is leverage," she continued, thinking it through as she said it. "He knows he can't hold it long term. He's using the dispute to draw your attention north so that something else, somewhere else in the territory, can move while you're looking the wrong direction." The fire crackled. "That," Calder said, after a moment, in a tone she hadn't heard from him yet, something quieter than his usual quiet, something that sounded almost like recalibration, "is exactly right." He sounded, she thought, slightly surprised. She decided not to show how much that mattered. "What's he actually after?" she asked, and he told her. All of it. The full picture, the real political landscape, the thing he was watching, and what he intended to do about it. No edited version. No the parts that are appropriate for you to know. He spoke to her like someone whose intelligence he had already decided to respect, and she sat across from him in the firelight and felt something shift, subtle, tectonic, the quiet rearranging of an assumption she'd been carrying. She had expected to be ornamental here. She was not being treated as ornamental. She woke in the dark from a dream she didn't want to describe even to herself. The pack hall, her father's voice. 40 wolves not looking at her. The specific sound of a door closing on a version of her life she hadn't been given the chance to defend. She woke sharply, heart loud against her ribs, the small dark room of the lodge strange for a moment before it settled into recognition. The fire had burned low. The snow was still falling. She could hear it, the particular muffled silence of heavy snowfall, the world outside gone soft and sealed. She lay still and breathed and waited for her heart to finish its business. On the other side of the curtain she heard him, not movement, presence, the particular quality of wakefulness that a person has when they are very still and very alert, the held quality of someone who has heard something and is waiting to understand what it means. His breathing was awake, even, careful, the breathing of someone who wasn't sleeping and wasn't pretending to be. He had heard her wake. He did not come through the curtain. He did not say her name, or ask if she was all right, or do any of the things that would have required her to perform composure she didn't currently have. He simply stayed awake on his side of the partition, present and quiet, not intruding and not retreating. And then, so gradual she almost missed it. The fire brightened. She watched the light shift through the curtain's edge. He had gotten up silently and added a log to the fire. That was all. No words, no gesture, no acknowledgement that required a response. Just warmth, offered quietly, in the only form she could have received it. She lay in the warmer light and thought about a man who understood, instinctively, what kind of comfort she could accept, she thought. I don't know what to do with someone like this. And then, before she could decide, the warmth of the fire reached her and her heartbeat settled and her eyes grew heavy, and she was asleep again, pulled under by something that felt, in her most unguarded moment, remarkably like being held without being touched. Chapter 4. The Laugh. Neither of them mentioned the night. This was, she understood by morning, its own kind of language, an agreement reached without negotiation, the mutual, wordless decision not to make each other explain something that didn't need explaining. She had woken, he had heard, he had added a log to the fire. That was the whole of it, and they both knew the whole of it. And neither of them needed to stand in a small kitchen over coffee and perform the social ritual of acknowledging it. She was grateful for that, in a way she couldn't have articulated without embarrassing herself. So instead, she made coffee, and he was already at the north window when she came out of her sleeping area, standing with his arms loosely at his sides, and his eyes on the tree line with the particular quality of attention he gave to the territory, alert but unhurried. The way someone looks at something they are responsible for, and at peace with being responsible for. The snow had stopped in the night. The world outside was absolutely white and absolutely still. She poured 2 cups and carried them both to the window, and held one out to him without looking at him. And he took it without looking at her, and they stood together at the glass and looked at the stopped snow and the white tree line and the pale sky that hadn't decided yet what it intended to do next. Their fingers did not touch in the handoff. It felt like they did anyway. She drank her coffee and looked at the snow and thought, this is the second morning. And then she thought, only the second morning. And she was not certain whether that felt like a short time or a very long one. By mid-morning, the snow had sealed them in completely. Not dangerously. The lodge had stores enough for a week, and the firewood was stacked floor to ceiling along the east wall, and the territory wolves knew their location and would send word if the situation required. But the road back to the manor was impassable by vehicle. The path through the forest too deep for anything but wolf travel. And the sky outside had that flat, loaded quality that meant the first fall was not the last. They were staying. This produced, in the lodge, a particular kind of atmospheric shift, the shift that happens when two people who have been treating their proximity as an temporary suddenly understand it is not. The small adjustments of people calibrating to a new duration. She rearranged her things in her sleeping area with more intention. He moved the relay equipment to a more permanent position by the east wall. Small things, practical things, things that said, "We are here for a while, and we might as well be here properly." She pulled a chair to the window and read. He sat at the table with territorial maps spread before him and worked through something she didn't ask about. The fire kept time for them in the unhurried way of fires, consuming itself slowly, requiring attention at intervals, marking the morning in the rhythm of added logs and settling coals. Outside, the sky delivered on its promise and snow began again. Gentler this time, without the previous night's conviction, more like a continuation than a new event. She read. He worked. The silence between them had texture now. Not the silence of two strangers enduring proximity, but the silence of two people who had arrived without discussing it, at the understanding that they did not need to fill each other's air. She found this extraordinary. She found, more specifically, that she found this extraordinary. That she, Lyra Voss, who had spent years in the performance of social ease, who had learned to manage every room she was in, who had, never in her adult life, sat with another person in sustained quiet, without the low hum of social management running beneath it, was sitting in a snowbound lodge with a man she had known for 4 days, and she was simply reading, just reading. She turned a page and did not examine it. Devlin reached them on the relay at mid-morning. She could hear the exchange from her chair. Calder's side of it, at least, which was mostly single words, and the occasional confirmation. Devlin, she gathered, had a great deal to say. The relay crackled, and she could hear faintly the particular cadence of a man delivering information at length with editorial commentary woven in. Calder said yes 3 times. He said no once, with a finality that apparently settled the matter. He said something she couldn't hear that produced an audible pause on Devlin's end, followed by what sounded like resigned acceptance. He came back inside and returned to his maps. "Everything all right?" she asked, without looking up from her book. "Yes," he said. Then, after a moment, "Devlin has opinions about the Northern faction's motivation. Are they the same as mine?" A pause. "Largely." She turned a page. "Did you tell him that?" "No." She looked up then. He was bent over the map again, a pencil moving along a boundary line. She looked at the back of his head. The dark hair at his nape, slightly overgrown. The tension he carried through his shoulders that was so habitual, she suspected he no longer noticed it. "Why not?" she asked. He glanced up. Across the room their eyes met, his forest green and direct and briefly, entirely unguarded. Because it wasn't his conclusion to hear. She held his gaze for 1 moment, 2. Then she looked back at her book and did not say anything else, and neither did he, and the snow continued its gentle, uncommitted falling outside the window. She beat him at chess after lunch. This was not. She would reflect afterward, the interesting part. The interesting part was the how of it. The specific sequence of events that led from a quiet afternoon to the moment everything shifted. They had set up the board without discussing it, the way you do when something has become a habit faster than you noticed it becoming one. She had white, he had black. The game opened the way their games tended to open. Methodical, careful, each of them feeling out the other's pattern rather than committing to a strategy too early. Then Devlin called again. The relay crackled to life with the particular urgency of someone who has remembered something important, and Calder went to answer it, and the game continued in the technical sense that the board remained set up, but in the practical sense, Calder was now conducting two simultaneous operations. A territorial coordination on the relay, and a chess game against an opponent who had his full attention, and the split was showing. She watched him. She watched the way his focus divided, and the way his eyes moved between the relay and the board, and the way his hand reached to move a piece with the slightly distracted confidence of a man who trusted his chess instincts enough not to think too carefully about them. She let him make 3 moves like that. Then she took his queen. It was a quiet move. She set the piece aside without ceremony and sat back in her chair and waited. He finished the relay exchange. He turned back to the board. He looked at it. She watched the moment arrive. The specific, contained moment of a very competent man looking at a board and finding it not what he expected, running the last 3 moves back through his memory with the expression of someone doing rapid and unflattering arithmetic. She had left him a viable game. She had not humiliated him. She had simply, clearly, and rather elegantly taken his queen through a line he had not seen coming. And the evidence of it was sitting beside the board where she had placed it, and his expression was the expression of a man recalculating everything. She made one small observation, she said, very mildly, that his defensive pattern had a tendency to overcorrect to the left flank, which created a recurring blind spot on the queen's diagonal that she had been watching for since their first game at the manor. It was accurate. It was delivered without cruelty. It was, she would admit, delivered with a precision that was possibly slightly merciless. Something moved in his face. She saw it. The fractional shift, the almost expression, the exhale through his nose that was the closest thing to a laugh she had observed in him. Quiet, involuntary. The sound of someone who has been genuinely, pleasantly caught off guard, and whose body has responded before his composure could intervene. And then she laughed. It came out of nowhere, genuine and unguarded and bright. The kind of laugh that happens in the chest before the brain has any say in the matter. The kind that cannot be managed or measured or performed. It surprised her. It surprised her enough that she heard it, as if from a slight distance, this warm and undefended sound, filling the small lodge with something that felt like light. She stopped almost immediately, pressed her lips together, but it was out. It had existed. It was in the room now and could not be taken back. She looked at him. He had gone completely still, not uncomfortable still, not the still of a man who didn't know what to do with an unexpected thing. Arrested still. The way something stops when it encounters something it wasn't expecting and needs a genuine moment to absorb. The way you stop when something beautiful and unanticipated enters a room and you need a second to register it properly before you can do anything else. His eyes were on her face. She felt the look travel through her like a current, warm and direct and entirely without the careful management he usually applied to his own expressions. For one unguarded moment she saw what was beneath the control, what he looked like when he forgot to look like nothing. Then it was gone. He looked back at the board. He repositioned a piece, but something in the lodge had changed. She could feel it, subtle, atmospheric, the way pressure changes before weather. The air between them had a different quality now, charged and specific. Like a held breath the room was taking. She was aware of him differently than she had been 10 minutes ago. which she would not have believed was possible, given how aware of him she'd already been. She looked at the board. Neither of them mentioned it. They played the second game in the same quiet, and he won it with a focused ruthlessness that told her the first game had recalibrated him entirely. No more divided attention. No more trusting his instincts without backing them up. He had learned. She had known he would. She noted, with something she refused to name, that she liked that about him. After dinner, which she cooked this time, something simple and slightly better than simple, using the lodge's stores, with the efficiency of someone who has learned to cook in kitchens that aren't their own. She told him about Marin, not the full story. She wasn't ready for the full story. She said she had a sister who was 21 and impulsive and the best person she knew, and she hadn't been able to contact her since leaving Al. And she had been carrying that, quietly, like a stone in her chest for 4 days. She said it looking at the fire rather than at him. It was easier that way. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not respond, that he might simply acknowledge it with silence, the way he acknowledged many things. Then he said, "Her communications haven't been restricted." She looked at him. "I confirmed it the day you arrived," he said. Devlin checked the channels. "No one in Ashvale has blocked her outgoing contact. You can write. You can call." A pause. "I should have told you sooner." She stared at him. The stone in her chest did something complicated. "You arranged that before I asked." "I arranged it when you arrived," he said. "I was waiting until you wanted something enough to ask for it." She looked at his face, at the steady, unhurried calm of it, the complete absence of expectation for gratitude or recognition, the simple factual delivery of a man who had done a thing because it needed doing and had waited for the right moment to say so. She thought, "What kind of man does this?" she thought. "What kind of man does this and says nothing?" She did not say either of those things. "Thank you," she said, quietly and directly, without the social padding of an elaborate response. Just that. Just the true thing. He nodded once and looked back at the fire. She wrote the letter that night. She sat at the table by the lamp while he read across the room, and she wrote to Man and she wrote to Marin. Not everything, not yet, but enough. That she was all right. That the place was not what she had expected. That there was a man here she did not fully understand, but who had, before she asked, made sure she could contact her sister. She wrote, "I think I misjudged this situation. I am not certain yet in which direction." She sealed the envelope. She looked across the room. He was reading, genuinely this time, the book open and his eyes moving, and the particular quality of absorption of a person who has found the thing they are reading actually interesting. In the firelight, his features were less angular, the shadows softer, the careful management he wore like a second skin, relaxed by tiredness and warmth and the comfortable late evening state of a long day that had not required him to be anything in particular. She thought, "I have stopped counting the days until I can leave." She did not know when that had happened. She could not identify the specific moment. It had simply occurred, the way the chess habit had occurred, the way the comfortable silence had occurred, the way the awareness of him had crept into her peripheral vision, until it was simply part of how she saw the room. She put the letter with her things for tomorrow. She looked at the fire. She thought about a laugh that had come out of her like something that had been waiting, and about the way he had gone still. Arrested, reverent, like a man who had not expected to witness something and didn't know yet what to do with having witnessed it. She thought about a man who had quietly, without announcement, removed one stone from the weight she had been carrying. She closed her eyes. The fire crackled. The snow pressed against the windows. The lodge held them both in its small, warm circle of light, and outside the world was white and sealed and entirely indifferent. And inside something was happening that neither of them had named yet, and both of them already knew. Chapter 5. The Window. She knew before she opened her eyes. There was a quality to the morning, a particular brightness behind the curtain, a specific quality of silence from outside that told her the snow had stopped. Not the temporary stopping of a storm, catching its breath, but the genuine, settled stopping of weather that has finished what it came to do and moved on. The kind of silence that means the world has been rearranged overnight and is waiting quietly for someone to come and see what it has made of itself. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and thought, "Today we go back." The thought arrived without the relief she might have expected 4 days ago. She noticed that. She noticed the noticing. Then she got up. He was already in the kitchen, not cooking, standing at the window with a cup in his hand, looking out at the stopped snow with the expression he wore when he was assessing something. The territory read. The morning check. She had come to recognize it. The slight forward quality of his attention. The way he went very still when he was absorbing information from a landscape. The way other people absorbed it from a page. She moved to the stove without speaking. He made room without speaking. This was, she thought, perhaps the most remarkable thing about being in his company. The absence of the social machinery she had run her entire adult life. The constant low-level management of how she was being perceived, what she was communicating, what was expected, and whether she was meeting it. Here, in this small kitchen, on this white morning, there was simply the stove and the coffee, and 2 people who had stopped requiring each other to perform. She could not have said when that had happened. She handed him a refilled cup. He took it. Their fingers did not touch. She was beginning to think the space between almost touching and touching was its own kind of language, a whole vocabulary of restraint and awareness that said more, in its withholding, than contact would have. She poured her own cup and went to stand at the window beside him. Outside, the territory was extraordinary. The snow had settled over everything with the indiscriminate generosity of something that doesn't distinguish between the beautiful and the ordinary. Old fence posts and ancient tree limbs, and the worn path to the relay station, all equally transformed, equally covered, equally made into something that looked like a place from a story rather than a place from a life. The tree line stood dark against all that white, the pines heavy laden, the sky above them the pale silver blue of a winter morning that intended to be clear. 3 days, she said. He looked at the sky. 3 days, he agreed. A pause. You were right about 4, he said, without particular emphasis, the way someone states a fact they have no investment in disputing. She looked at him sideways. The corner of her mouth moved. I know. The exhale through his nose. Almost a laugh. The thing he did that she had come to anticipate without admitting she anticipated it. The small, involuntary evidence of a warmth he was still deciding whether to allow. They stood at the window together and drank their coffee and looked at what the storm had made of the world. And the morning moved around them at its own pace, and neither of them hurried it. Breakfast was unhurried in the way that final mornings often are, the last morning of a specific kind of time, when both people in a place know its ending and choose, wordlessly, to let it end, slowly. He cooked. She sat on the counter. She had started doing this the previous morning, and he had not told her to move, and she had decided that constituted permission. She sat with her second cup of coffee and watched him work, and did not pretend she wasn't watching. He worked around her, This was what she noticed. Not that he tolerated her presence on the counter, but that he genuinely worked around her, reaching across without asking her to shift, angling the pan without requiring her to reposition, moving with the specific ease of someone who has incorporated another person's presence into their spatial awareness so completely that they no longer experience it as an intrusion. She thought, he has been doing that since I arrived. She thought, accounting for me, in every room, every arrangement, every movement. She drank her coffee and looked at the line of his shoulders and did not say anything, because there was nothing yet that she knew how to say. After breakfast, he went to the relay to confirm their departure time, and she walked the perimeter of the lodge once in the snow. Not for any practical reason, but because she wanted the cold air and the specific silence of a landscape that had just finished a large weather event and was resting. She walked with her hands in her pockets, and her breath making brief clouds, and the snow compressing softly under her boots. She thought about the last 3 days. She thought about them carefully, the way she thought about things that mattered. Not circling them anxiously, but examining them directly, turning them in the light to see what they actually were, rather than what she was afraid they might be. She had arrived at this lodge with the appropriate wariness of a woman who has been arranged and managed and traded and lied to, who knows from experience that kindness extended by powerful men tends to have a cost attached to it that reveals itself later in conditions less favorable to negotiation. She had been waiting for the cost. She was still waiting. There was no cost. There was only a man who cooked without announcement and made room at the counter and added a log to the fire at 3 in the morning and arranged her sister's communication channels before she thought to ask, and played chess across from her in the evenings with the focus of someone who found her genuinely worth playing against. She stood at the edge of the tree line and looked back at the lodge. Smoke from the chimney, warm light behind the windows. A building that had no right to look like shelter, and somehow did, she thought. I have to be careful, she thought. I think it may already be too late for careful. She went back inside. He told her about his brother in the early afternoon. She had not planned to ask. She had filed the sealed East Wing in the category of things she would wait to understand, committed to the patience of a woman who knows that certain doors open in their own time and cannot be forced. But they were sitting by the fire in the main room, the packed bags by the door, the lodge stripped back to its basic self, in the way of a place that has been inhabited briefly and is being returned to its neutral state. And she was looking at the fire, and he was looking at the window, and the afternoon had the specific quality of an ending. And she said, quietly, without pressure, "Tell me about," before he looked at her. "Before Thornveil," she clarified. "Before all of this, who you were." She half expected the wall, the deflection, the polite, absolute redirection of a private man, being asked a private question by someone who had not yet earned the answer. Instead, he was quite quiet for a long time, the specific quiet of someone choosing how much of a true thing to say, and then he said, "I had a brother." His voice was the same, low, unhurried, controlled, but there was something beneath it. A weight that was not grief exactly, not anymore, but the permanent topographic change that grief makes in a person, the way it reshapes the landscape so completely that even after the acute pain is gone, the shape of the land is different and you know it forever. "Ewan," he said, "younger by 4 years. He was a pause, not like me. He was loud. He thought everything was worth attempting and most things were worth laughing about." Another pause. He was right about both. She didn't speak. She had learned that his silences were not invitations to fill. Pack war, he said. 8 years ago. A border conflict we should have resolved before it escalated. I didn't resolve it in time. His jaw was working. The tell. The thing he did when the surface was calm and something beneath it was not. The east wing was his. I haven't. He stopped. It isn't ready, he said again. The same words as before. She understood them intently now. She looked at him across the settled fire. She did not offer comfort. She could see that he didn't want it. Not the soft, cushioning kind. Not the performance of sympathy. What he had offered her was a fact, and what he needed in return was for the fact to be received without being managed. I'm sorry about your brother, she said. Simply. Just that. The true thing without architecture. He nodded once. The fire settled between them. That's why you stopped, she said after a while, not a question. Understanding arriving. He looked at her. Needing people, she said quietly. That's why you stopped. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Fractional. Almost invisible. But she was looking closely enough to see it. The recognition of being accurately read by someone who had no reason to know you well enough to do it. Yes, he said. She nodded. She looked back at the fire. She thought about a man who had built an empire of self-sufficiency on the architecture of a single loss, who had become so practiced at not needing anyone that he'd forgotten. It was a practice, and started believing it was a truth, she thought. I know what that costs. She said nothing. She didn't need to. They left the lodge at 4 in the afternoon, when the light was already going gold and thin through the trees, and the shadows were long across the snow. The road had been partially cleared by the territory wolves. She saw the evidence of it in the packed-down sections, the work done quietly and without announcement. The pack's care for its alpha, expressed in practical, unglamorous labor. The drive back was quiet, different from the quiet of their first evening, less careful, less armored, the quiet of two people who have been in close company for 3 days and have settled into something that doesn't require ongoing maintenance. She watched the landscape on her side. He watched the road. The trees thinned as they went south, the snow giving way to bare ground at the verges, the sky above the manor visible long before they reached it. Warm light in the windows, smoke from 3 chimneys, Devlin's vehicle in the drive, with the particular crooked park of someone who had arrived recently, and in a hurry, she thought. Back to the manor, she thought. I am not as unhappy about that as I should probably be. Her room was warm when she arrived. The fireplace was burning, had been burning. She could tell from the state of the logs, for at least an hour before she got there. Someone had known their arrival time and had come ahead to prepare, and the room was exactly as she had left it, and also exactly as it had always been. Ready for her, warmed for her, arranged with the particular quiet care that she had come to understand was simply how things were done here. She set her bag down. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the fire. She thought about standing at the lodge window, with their shoulders almost touching, and the stopped snow and the silver-blue sky. She thought about the reflection in the glass. The first time she had seen his eyes on her, with the management down, with the distance gone, with the full and direct and unguarded weight of his attention. She thought about a man who had learned 8 years ago to stop needing people. She thought, he is looking at me like someone who has forgotten to stop. She sat down in the chair by the fire, slowly, with the careful movements of someone carrying something fragile inside their chest. She thought, what kind of man does all of this? And then, beneath that thought, quieter, more honest, the thought she had been building toward without knowing it all day. What kind of man does all of this for me? The fire burned. The manor settled around her. Outside, the territory moved through its evening. Wolves in the tree line, birds going quiet, the dark coming in from the east the way it always did, patient and inevitable and entirely unbothered by whatever was happening inside a woman sitting in a chair by a fire, realizing, slowly, and without any ability to stop it, that she was not who she had been a week ago. She did not know yet whether that was a loss or a beginning. She suspected with a clarity that frightened her that it was both. Chapter 6. What You Are to Him. Seraphine arrived on a Tuesday. Lyra noticed her first from the library window, a small, upright figure moving along the stone path from the eastern gate with the unhurried certainty of someone sunken who has been walking toward things her entire life and has never once considered that a thing might not be there when she arrived. White-haired, deep brown skin, wrapped in a heavy gray coat that had seen many winters and been kept carefully through all of them. She carried nothing. She needed nothing carried. Lyra had met her once, briefly, on her second day at the manor. An introduction in the front hall that had lasted perhaps 4 minutes and had consisted largely of Seraphine looking at her with gold-brown eyes that saw considerably more than they indicated, and then saying, with the warm finality of someone issuing a verdict rather than a greeting, "Good, you have a spine." And then she had walked away. Lyra had not known what to do with that. She still didn't, entirely. She watched the old woman cross the garden now and felt something she could not precisely name. A premonitory quality, a sense of atmosphere, shifting, the way the air changes before a storm that the sky is not yet showing you. She turned away from the window and went back to her book and told herself it was nothing. She was halfway through the next page when Devlin appeared in the library doorway. "Seraphine would like to walk with you," he said, "in the East Garden." He said it with the specific neutrality of someone who is delivering a message rather than offering an opinion about it. But his eyes, she noticed, were doing something careful, something that was not quite concern and not quite warning, but occupied the territory between them. "Now?" she asked. "She's already outside," he said. She closed her book. The East Garden in winter was a spare and beautiful thing. The formal beds gone to their brown bones, the old stone paths salted clear of ice, the bare-limbed fruit trees along the southern wall, standing with the dignified patience of things that have been through many winters and expect to be through many more. It smelled of cold earth and evergreen, and the particular mineral sharpness of stone that has been rained on recently. Seraphine was waiting at the garden's center, hands clasped behind her back, face tilted slightly upward toward the gray sky as if reading something in it. She did not turn when Lyra approached. She simply began walking, a slow circuit of the garden's inner path, and Lyra fell into step beside her, with the understanding that this was how the conversation was going to happen. In motion, side by side, looking at the garden rather than each other. She had the sense, not for the first time with this woman, that every detail of this encounter had been considered in advance. They walked half the circuit in silence. Then Seraphine said, "How much do you know about fated bonds?" Her voice was unhurried, conversational even, as if she were asking about the weather or the quality of the winter so far. But there was nothing conversational about the question, and they both knew it. Lyra kept her pace even. "The general understanding," she said carefully. "What everyone knows, that they're rare, that they're recognized by the wolf before the person, that they can't be dissolved once fully formed." "That's most of it," Seraphine said. She bent and touched the branch of a bare rose bush with one gloved finger, examining it with the focused attention of a woman who grows things and knows what she is looking at. What you may not know is how the recognition works.
From the wolf's side.
Lyra said nothing. She was listening with her whole body now. It isn't gradual, Seraphine said, straightening, resuming her slow walk. People assume it is. They assume it builds, that the wolf becomes more certain over time, that it's a process of accumulation. It isn't. She paused. It's immediate. The moment a wolf is in the same space as its fated mate, it knows, completely, without ambiguity, the way you know when a fire has gone out. Not through reasoning, not through assessment, through the sudden presence of something that was not there before. Lyra's feet kept moving on the stone path. The wolf knows, Seraphine continued. And then the person has to decide what to do with what the wolf knows. Whether to act on it, whether to wait, whether to give the other person space and time, and the freedom to arrive at their own understanding without being claimed before they are ready. A pause. That last choice is the rarest one. Most wolves can't manage it. The pull is too strong. The certainty is too complete. She stopped walking. Lyra stopped beside her. The old woman turned and looked at her. Those gold-brown eyes, direct and kind, and entirely without apology for what she was about to say. Calder has known since the moment you arrived, she said. You are his fated mate. You have been in the wolf's understanding from the first second you stood in the same room. Every careful distance he has kept, every arranged comfort, every fire already burning when you returned to your room. None of it was obligation. She held Lyra's gaze. He has been waiting, giving you space to feel safe, giving you time to choose. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere above them, a bird crossed the white sky and was gone. Lyra stood completely still and felt the world rearrange itself around a fixed point, felt the last 4 days reorder themselves, every moment recontextualizing, every silence and every careful distance and every almost touch assembling into a picture she had been looking at from the wrong angle and could now suddenly completely see. She breathed in, she breathed out. My father, she said. Her voice was very level. She was proud of how level it was. Did he know? Seraphine's expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged the quality of the question, the precision of it, the way Lyra had gone directly to the thing that mattered most. Yes, the old woman said. The word landed like a stone into still water. He knew, Lyra said. Not a question. Understanding, arriving in full. He knew what a fated bond meant. He knew it couldn't be dissolved. He knew the alliance would be permanent regardless of anything I did or didn't choose. She stopped. He traded me to the one man whose bond to me would be unbreakable, and he didn't tell me. He secured his pack's future, Seraphine said quietly. He did it through his daughter, without her knowledge or her consent. I won't soften that. Lyra looked at the bare garden, at the winter-stripped roses, at the old stone walls holding all of it in. She thought, I was never given a choice, she thought. And yet here I am, in a garden, being given one now. She thought, why does that distinction feel so important? She did not have the answer yet, but she knew it mattered. The difference between being told and being given the truth in time to do something with it. Between the man who had arranged her circumstances without her knowledge, and the man who had waited, apparently indefinitely, for her to be ready to know. He should have told me himself, she said finally. Yes, Seraphine agreed. He should have. She found him in the study. The walk from the garden to the study took 4 minutes, and she used all of them. Not to calm down, but to arrive at clarity. She was not interested in arriving at this conversation in a state that could be read as weakness. She was furious and she was devastated, and she was also, beneath both of those things, something more complicated that she refused to look at directly yet. She pushed open the study door. He was at the desk. Maps again, the territorial documentation that seemed to be a constant of his days. He looked up when she entered. He saw her face. He set the pen down. She stood in the doorway and looked at him across the room and said, "Is it true?" Not a question, a threshold. The line between before and after. He did not look away. He did not reach for any of the deflections available to a man in this position. Did not make her question more specific. Did not ask what she'd been told. Did not manage the moment with the practiced authority of someone who has been managing moments for years. He simply looked at her steadily, with the wall down in the specific way it had been down at the lodge window, at the fire, in the chess game. The way it came down she understood now, when something was too important to manage. "Yes," he said, one word. Clean and complete. No apology attached and no defense offered. She came into the room. She did not sit. She crossed to the center of it and stood with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and the full measure of what she felt in her face. Because she was done, she decided in that moment, performing composure for this man. "You knew," she said, "from the beginning." "Yes, She stopped, restructured. The fireplace, the letters, the lodge, all of it. "Yes, and you didn't tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Not evasively. She could see him choosing the true answer over the easy one, the way he always did when it mattered. "I was waiting," he said, "until you trusted me enough to hear it without it feeling like a claim." She looked at him. "And my father?" His jaw tightened. "The tell. I didn't know he hadn't told you until after you arrived. I assumed." A pause. "I assumed you had been given the truth and had chosen to come anyway." "I was given nothing," she said. "I was arranged." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had known, from the moment she walked through his door, what she was to him, and who had lit her fireplace and arranged her letters, and sat across from her in a snowbound lodge, and played chess with her in the evenings, and had not once, made her feel the weight of what he knew she was to him. She thought, "I cannot decide if that is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me, or something I will never entirely forgive," she thought. "I think it might be both." "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. She turned toward the door. "Lyra," she stopped, her back to him. "If you had never trusted me enough to hear it," he said. His voice was quiet, entirely level. "If you had never been ready," a pause that had weight in it, depth, the pause of someone saying a true thing they have never said aloud before. "I would have waited anyway." She stood at the door and felt those words go through her like a current, warm and specific and entirely without the softening of performance. Just the truth of a man who had decided, somewhere in the first moments of knowing her, that she was worth any duration of patience. She did not turn around. She couldn't yet. If she turned around, she would not leave the room. And she needed to leave the room. She needed the space of walls and distance, and her own breath to think through something this large. "I know," she said. Her voice, to her own ears, was the voice of a woman who meant something more complicated than the words she was using. She hoped he heard it. She suspected, from everything she now understood about this man, that he did. She left. She sat on the floor of her room. Not the chair, not the bed. The floor, with her back against the frame, and her knees drawn up, and her hands in her lap, and the fire burning in the grate with the same quiet reliability it always had, lit before she returned as it always was, warm in the room as it always was. She had thought, sitting in this room on her first night, that the lit fireplace was a detail, a courtesy, the work of some unnamed staff member fulfilling a standard of hospitality. She knew now that it had never been that. From the first night, from before she arrived, from the moment he knew she was coming, someone had been making sure this room was warm when she returned to it. Not because it was protocol, because it was what she needed, and he had known what she needed before she arrived. And he had been quietly, consistently making sure she had it. Without signature and without expectation of acknowledgement, she sat with that. She sat with all of it. The father, who had traded her, like a territory boundary, the bond she hadn't been told about, the man across the hall, who had known since the first moment and had chosen, against every instinct of the wolf, to wait. She thought, I have never been given a choice, she thought. I think I am being given one now. She looked at the fire. She did not know, sitting on the floor in the warm room, with the house quiet around her, and the evening coming in through the window, what she was going to do with the choice. But she knew, with a clarity that bypassed every defense she had spent years constructing, that arrived not in her mind but somewhere older and more honest, that the choice terrified her precisely because she already knew what she wanted, and what she wanted was him. Chapter 7. Running. She did not leave impulsively. That was the thing she would return to later, when she had the distance and the clarity to examine it honestly. The fact that she had not bolted, had not grabbed her bag in the heat of the confrontation, and walked out through the front door, while the feeling was still sharp enough to carry her. She had sat on the floor of her room, and she had thought, and she had slept, and she had woken the next morning, and made coffee, and moved through the day with the careful deliberateness of a woman who was still deciding. She gave herself a full day. She sat with the revelation the way she sat with difficult books, not skimming, not rushing toward the conclusion, but reading each part fully before moving to the next. She took the bond apart and looked at its components. She took her father's decision apart and looked at that too. The cold pragmatism of it, the way it would have seemed, from his angle, like a solution elegant in its permanence. She took Calder apart, or tried to, and found that he was considerably harder to disassemble than she wanted him to be. Because the thing she kept returning to, the thing she could not argue away no matter how many angles she approached it from, was this. He had known. From the first moment, and he had chosen, against the full force of a wolf's instinct, to give her time. Not because he was indifferent. The opposite. Because he understood, somehow, what she had been through, what she needed, what kind of arrival would have made it impossible for her to stay. He had understood that a woman who had been traded and lied to and publicly humiliated needed, more than anything, to feel that she had a choice. So he had made sure she had one. She hated how much that mattered. She hated it because it made him impossible to dismiss. She had been very good, over the years, at dismissing, at identifying the mechanism behind the kindness, the strategy beneath the warmth, the cost that would eventually attach itself to anything offered freely by a powerful man. She had built that skill out of necessity, and she had relied on it, and it had kept her from being hurt in the particular way that hope being withdrawn causes hurt. But she could not find the mechanism here. She had looked carefully, thoroughly, with the full application of everything she knew about powerful men and political arrangements and the ways that wolves in authority operated. She could not find it. What she found instead was a man who played chess alone and added logs to fires in the middle of the night, and had arranged her sister's communications before she thought to ask, and had said, with complete and unhurried honesty, that he would have waited forever. By evening of the first day, she understood that the problem was not that she didn't believe him. The problem was that she did. She packed the small bag on the morning of the second day. She stood in front of the wardrobe and looked at both bags, the large one and the small one, and she thought about what she was doing and why, and she was honest with herself about it in the way she was always honest with herself when no one was watching. She was not leaving because of the bond. She was not leaving because of her father's manipulation, though that was a wound she would be sitting with for a long time. She was not even leaving because of Calder's silence about what he knew. She had thought that through and arrived reluctantly at the understanding that his reasons were defensible. She could be angry about it and still see that. She was leaving because she wanted to stay. That was the whole of it, stripped of everything else. She wanted to stay with a depth and a certainty that frightened her more than anything that had happened in the last week. Because she had wanted things before, had trusted before, had believed before. And she knew from experience the specific devastation of wanting something that turns out to be different than it appeared. She could not survive that again. She was not sure she had the material left for it, so she packed the small bag because the small bag was what you packed when you were not entirely certain you were going, when part of you was already making the argument for return, when some subterranean part of your decision-making had already registered information that the conscious part hadn't caught up to yet. She noted this. She did not examine it. She called a car a practical choice, a human choice, the choice of someone trying to stay ordinary and grounded in the logic of a world that had roads and schedules, and the normalcy of point A to point B. She would go to the nearest town. She would find a place to stay, she would think. She told herself she was thinking. Devlin was in the hallway. She had known, some part of her, that he would be. He was always in the hallways when things mattered. Not surveillance, not management, just the quiet presence of someone whose job was to know where things were, and who had been doing the job long, enough that he no longer needed to work at it. He looked at her bag. He looked at her face. He said nothing. She looked at him, at his pale gray eyes, and the studied neutrality of his expression, and the single, almost imperceptible thing that moved behind it, something that was not quite sorrow and not quite acceptance, but lived in that neighborhood. She thought about asking him to tell Calder. She thought about leaving a note. She thought about all the ways people cushion departures with words that make the leaving feel less like what it is. "I know," she said, to the unspoken thing, to the look in his eyes. He nodded. He stepped aside. She walked past him and through the front door and down the stone steps into the cold morning air. And she did not look back at the manor because she knew that if she did, she would see the lit windows and the old ivy and the building that had no right to look like home. And she would not get in the car. She got in the car. She did not look back. She was 40 minutes from the manor boundary when the car stopped, not mechanically. The engine did not falter. The road was clear. The driver had not braked for any visible reason. The car simply stopped. The way things stop when something is standing in front of them that has made a decision about whether they will continue. There were wolves in the road, not Thornveil wolves. She knew that immediately, in the way that you know things your body reads faster than your mind does. Wrong posture, wrong formation. The particular arrangement of 6 large wolves in the road with the loose, patient confidence of people who have been waiting rather than people who have arrived, who have chosen a place and held it which means they knew she was coming before she started. She had exactly long enough to understand what that meant. The car door opened from outside. Ren stepped out of the tree line. He looked exactly as she remembered, which was to say he looked like the version of himself he had always wanted to be seen as. Tall, composed, unhurried, wearing his authority the way he wore everything, as a garment carefully chosen rather than something that had grown in him. He had a quality she had once mistaken for confidence, and later understood was performance so consistent it had become indistinguishable from the original. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who was satisfied, which was its own kind of information. Satisfied men have already decided how something ends. "You left earlier than I expected," he said. He said it the way you say something to someone you know well, with the intimacy of shared history weaponized into presumption. "I thought he'd have you more settled by now." She looked at him. She kept her face still. "What do you want, Ren?" Not a question. A request for him to get to the point, delivered in the voice she used when she had decided that someone was not worth the performance of fear. He tilted his head. The smile didn't move. "You've been very useful," he said. "You and your arrangement. It's given us exactly the visibility into Thornveil's northern position that we needed." He glanced at the car, at the driver, at the 6 wolves behind her. "We're going to continue using you, just from a different location." She understood then, completely, in one assembled moment, the way a picture assembles from its components, when you've finally seen the thing the pieces were always showing you. This was not about her. It had never been about her. This was about Thornveil's territory, about the Northern Pass, about a rival alpha who wanted Thornveil's boundary rights, and had decided that removing the alpha's leverage point was more efficient than fighting for the land directly. She was not the target. She was the instrument. "You're using me as leverage," she said. "I'm using you as a message," he corrected pleasantly. "There's a distinction. A message implies response options. We're giving Calder Ashwood a very reasonable set of them." She said nothing. She was memorizing the faces of the 6 wolves, the specific tree line, the angle of the road, the distance to the nearest boundary marker she'd seen from the car window 12 minutes back. She was cataloging exits and angles, and the particular body language of the wolf closest to her on the left, who was slightly less committed to his position than the others. She could see it in the way his weight was distributed, the small tell of someone who has been standing still for too long and whose attention has begun to drift at the edges. She was doing all of this while keeping her face in the expression of a woman who was simply standing still. "Stand down," Ren said pleasantly. Not to her. Into a relay device at his collar. "Send it." The farmhouse was stone, old, serviceable, set back from the road at the end of a narrow track through dense trees. It smelled of other wolves and cold and something else she identified after a moment as strategic desperation. The specific atmosphere of people who have committed to a plan and are now managing the gap between how they imagined it and how it actually is. They put her in a room at the back. Stone floor, a small window too high and too narrow to be practical. A door with a bolt she could hear them drawing from outside. The room was cold, but not dangerously so. There was a single blanket. Someone had put it there. Not out of kindness, she thought, but out of the pragmatics of keeping a leveraged point functional. She sat on the floor and breathed. She was not panicking. She had learned, over years of living in a pack structure, where she was frequently the least powerful person in the room, to distinguish between situations that required immediate action and situations that required patience. Panicking was useful in exactly neither category. She heard, faintly through the farmhouse's old walls, Wren's voice dictating to a runner. The terms: Thornveil cedes northern boundary rights, acknowledges the rival Alpha's territorial claim. Or the peace offering. She noted, without particular surprise, that he used that phrase, is returned in a different condition. She sat with that. She thought, he will come. She stopped that thought immediately, because that line of reasoning was not useful to her right now. Whether he came or did not come was information she did not have and could not act on. What she could act on was what was in this room. The high window, the bolted door, the blanket, the stone walls, with the particular old mortar that crumbled at the joints if you pressed it. She was examining the mortar at the window frame when she heard it. It came from outside, distant at first, then not distant at all, moving through the tree line at a speed, and with a directness that told her everything before she saw anything. The forest going quiet. The specific silence of prey animals and small creatures, and all the ordinary inhabitants of a wood, registering the presence of something that was not ordinary, moving toward the farmhouse, with the absolute certainty of something that has decided where it is going and intends to arrive. She stood up. She pressed her back against the wall beneath the window, and she looked at the bolted door, and she breathed, slow and deliberate, and she felt something move through her that was not fear. It was closer to relief. Closer, if she was honest. If she was entirely honest with herself, standing in a cold stone room with her back against the wall, and her heart doing something complicated and loud in her chest. Closer to something she was not ready to name. The farmhouse shook, not from impact, from presence. Chapter 8. What he is. The door did not break. She would remember that detail later. In the quiet days that followed, when she had the distance to reassemble the sequence of events into something she could hold and examine. The fact that the door did not break, it was removed. There was a distinction, and it mattered. Because breaking implied force applied without precision, the blunt application of power in excess of what the situation required. What happened to that door was something else entirely. It came away from its frame with a single, controlled movement. The bolt shearing, the hinges giving, the whole thing simply ceasing to be an obstacle with the specific quality of something that had been assessed and resolved rather than destroyed. The sound it made was not a crash. It was almost quiet. The quiet of something inevitable completing itself. And then he was in the doorway. She had seen him in many configurations over the past week and a half. At the long dinner table, at the lodge window, bent over territorial maps, sitting across a chessboard in the evenings with his eyes tracking pieces and occasionally, briefly, tracking her. She had seen him controlled, and she had seen him almost warm. And she had seen the particular version of him that emerged in the pre-dawn hours, when the careful layers were down. And he was simply a man, standing in a hallway because his wolf had heard something. She had not seen this. The wolf was close to the surface in a way she had no previous reference for. Not a transformation, not the full and irreversible crossing of that threshold, but the place just before it, where the two things occupy the same body and the tension between them is visible. His eyes were silver, not the flicker at the edges she had observed before in moments of strain, but fully, completely silver. The green gone entirely, replaced by something older and more absolute. His breathing was controlled with visible effort. The kind of control that is itself evidence of what is being controlled. The deliberate stillness of enormous force, being held just inside its own boundary. He was larger somehow, not physically different. She understood that. She was not imagining it, but present in a way that expanded the space he occupied, that made the stone room feel smaller and the doorway feel like a frame around something that did not usually get end-framed. His eyes found her immediately. 3 steps and he was across the room. His hands came to her face, both of them, large and warm and slightly rough, cupping her jaw and her cheeks with a gentleness so complete and so at odds with everything else about this moment that it stopped her breath, not claiming, not the gesture of a man arriving to collect what belongs to him, checking, the focused, urgent assessment of someone who needs to know one specific thing before anything else happens. Are you hurt? Not a question, a demand for information, delivered in the lowest register of his voice, quieter than she had ever heard him, which meant more than volume would have. No, she said. He looked at her, eyes moving over her face, her throat, her hands. The full rapid inventory of someone whose wolf had been running through a forest toward her. For however long it had taken him to get here and needed the physical confirmation that words alone could not provide. No, she said again, more firmly. I'm not hurt. Go, he went. She stayed at the window. She had told herself, in the cold, rational part of her mind that was still functioning, that she should stay away from the window, that watching was not useful, that she could not help, and she could potentially be distracted in ways that would not serve either of them. The cold, rational part of her mind made several excellent points. She watched anyway, because she had seen wolves fight before, pack demonstrations, the controlled sparring of training yards, the occasional formal challenge conducted under the observing eyes of pack law. And she understood those things as performances of a kind, displays of capacity, the showing of teeth without the full use of them. What was happening in the farmhouse yard was not that. There were 6 of them. She counted automatically, the way she had counted when she was memorizing the road, because information was the only weapon she'd had in that car, and the habit ran deep. 6 Ashvale wolves and wren, standing at the back of the group, with the expression of a man who has sent others to do a thing, and is watching to see if they do it adequately. Calder moved through them like something that had made a decision. She had no better description than that. It was not graceful. It was not the choreographed elegance of a practiced fighter performing for an audience. It was purposeful, direct, the movement of something that knows exactly what it is doing and exactly why, and has no energy to spend on anything. That is not the accomplishment of that specific purpose. He was not showing power. He was using it, and those 2 things look nothing alike. 2 wolves broke in the first 40 seconds. Not defeated, broke. The specific thing that happens when an animal encounters something its instincts cannot reconcile with continued opposition. When the wolf part of the brain overrides the human part and says, "This is not a fight we survive," and the body begins moving away before the mind has processed the instruction. 2 more took longer. She pressed her hand against the window glass and watched and did not look away even when she should have, because she understood this with great clarity in this moment. This was what he actually was. Beneath the chess games and the quiet kitchens and the careful distances, beneath the controlled, unhurried, managed man who had been giving her space and lighting her fireplace and waiting. This was also him, and the thing she felt watching it was not fear. She examined that honestly, standing at a too small window in a cold farmhouse room, and she found not fear, something more complicated, something that involved the specific, unmanageable recognition of a person whose full dimensions you are only now seeing, and the discovery that the full dimensions do not diminish them, but expand them, and the terrifying realization that you wanted the partial version, and you want this version too, and there is nothing left of the argument against wanting. He took 2 strikes. She saw them, could not have missed them, was watching too closely. The first across his left shoulder, deep and fast, from a wolf who had gotten through his guard by sacrificing its own position to do it. He absorbed it without breaking stride, which told her something about his pain threshold that she filed without dwelling on. The second at his side, in the gap between 2 movements, unavoidable and clearly significant. She saw it in the way his body registered it, the single, contained moment of physical acknowledgement before he continued. Both strikes from opponents who were, she noted, still on the ground when it was over. The last 2 wolves went, running, not retreating, the distinction again. The difference between a tactical withdrawal and the animal deep decision that this hill was not worth the dying. She watched them go into the trees and did not watch them further. Ren was still in the yard. He had not moved from his position at the back. She watched his face, watched the calculation happening there, the rapid reassessment of a man whose plan had just produced results he had not adequately modeled. He looked at the yard. He looked at Calder. He looked at the yard again. He ran. He was fast. She would grant him that. Genuinely fast, moving into the trees with the speed of a wolf who has excellent instincts for self-preservation even when those instincts arrive late. She watched the tree line absorb him. She watched Calder let him go. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched Ren disappear into the trees and did not follow. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Pursuit, perhaps. The completion of what had been started. Instead, he simply stood and watched the tree line, and then turned back toward the farmhouse with the unhurried, deliberate movement of a man who has finished doing the thing he came here to do, and does not need the additional thing. She thought, he let him go because coming back to me was more important than finishing it. She pressed her fingers against her own sternum, against the place where that realization had landed. She went to find the door he had removed from its frame. He was outside when she got there, standing at the edge of the yard where the packed dirt met the beginning of the tree line, one hand against a post, his head down, not collapsed, not defeated, the posture of someone taking a moment between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next, gathering the self back together after having spent a great deal of it. The shoulder wound was significant. She could see it clearly now. The dark of it against the darker wool of his shirt. The way he was carrying his left arm with the careful, slightly adjusted carriage of someone managing an injury without drawing attention to it. The side she had seen struck was less visible from this angle, but she knew it was there. She crossed the yard. She pulled the outer layer of her jacket off, the one with the thick lining, and she folded it against the shoulder wound without asking, and pressed it there, and held it with both hands, and he let her. He stood upright slightly when she reached him, adjusting his posture to accommodate what she was doing, and he looked at her from above, and she looked at him from below, and neither of them said anything for a moment. His eyes were still silver at the edges, not fully. The green was coming back, the wolf receding now that the urgency had resolved, but the silver was still there, tracing the outer ring, the last evidence of what he had been 30 minutes ago. She kept the pressure on his shoulder. He lowered himself to the ground, not all at once, not a collapse, but the deliberate, managed descent of someone whose legs have finished negotiating and have submitted a reasonable request to sit down. She went down with him, both of them on the cold dirt at the edge of the farmhouse yard, her jacket pressed against his shoulder, his back against the post, the silver in his eyes dimming slowly back to green. Behind them, the farmhouse was beginning to smoke. One of the wolves had knocked a lamp in the exit, she thought. Or perhaps it was the way old buildings respond to the kind of energy that had just moved through this one. Either way, the smoke was not catastrophic. Not yet. Just the building's way of registering that something significant had occurred within it. The forest was settling around them, the way a forest settles after something large has moved through it. The birds returning first, cautiously, then with more confidence, then the small sounds of ordinary life resuming in the undergrowth, the gradual reinstatement of the world's usual texture after the interruption. She held the pressure on his shoulder and felt him breathe. In and out, even and deep, the specific breathing of a body doing the work of recovery, cells and tissue and wolf-fast healing, all mobilizing with the efficiency of a creature built for exactly this. After a while she asked, "Why did you let him go?" She felt him look at her. "Ren?" "Yes." A pause, the sound of the forest settling. Somewhere in the farmhouse, something shifted, and the smoke increased slightly, and then stabilized. "Because he's not what matters," he said. She pressed her lips together. She kept her eyes on her hands and his shoulder and the jacket between them. "He'll come back, or someone like him will." "Yes," he said. "They usually do." A pause. "That's a problem for another day." She looked up at him then. He was looking at her, and the silver was almost gone now. The green returned and steady, and, with the wolf receding, the man was fully present again, with the full and direct and entirely unmanaged quality of his attention that she had learned over the past week and a half was the most unsettling thing about him. He was not performing anything. He was simply looking at her the way he had been looking at her. She understood now, since the first moment she walked into his house, with the complete and quiet and absolute certainty of a wolf who recognized something and had spent every moment since then trying to give it room enough to recognize him back. She sat in the dirt in front of him, with her hands pressed against his shoulder, and the bond humming between them like something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this configuration, this specific arrangement of two people, in a specific place, at a specific moment, all the obstacles finally exhausted, all the distances finally closed. She asked, "Why did you come?" His eyes were fully green now. "You know why," he said. She did. She had known, if she was entirely honest, since the moment she heard the forest go quiet. She had known before that, if she traced it back carefully. Known in the small bag she had packed instead of the large one. Known in the way she had not looked back at the manor when she left. Known in every moment of the last 11 days when she had been watching him, with the focused, peripheral, increasingly unconcealed attention of a woman who had already decided something, and was simply waiting for the rest of herself to catch up. She knew why he had come. She held the pressure on his shoulder and felt the bond settle between them like weather changing. The slow, complete atmospheric shift of something that has been holding itself in suspension, finally being allowed to land. Devlin arrived 23 minutes later. He came with 3 pack healers and 2 vehicles, and the specific organized efficiency of a man who had known, from the moment she left the manor with a single bag, that something was going to require managing and had prepared accordingly. He pulled into the farmhouse track and stepped out and surveyed the yard. The smoking building, his alpha sitting against a post with a jacket pressed to his shoulder, Lyra on the ground beside him, and his expression did the specific thing it did when the universe had confirmed what he had already privately concluded. He looked at the smoking farmhouse. He looked at the two of them. He looked at the particular quality of their proximity, the way she was leaning, and the way he was not moving away, and the way the air between them had a different density than air usually had. He said, "I'll call ahead to the manor." He said nothing else. He did not need to. The healers moved in with the practical warmth of people who are good at their jobs and have learned not to add words to the moments that don't require them. They checked her first. She let them, because she understood it was necessary, and because from the corner of her eye she could see Calder watching, and she understood that him watching was its own kind of necessity. Then they moved to him, and she sat back slightly and gave them room, and she watched them work. She watched him tolerate it with the specific, slightly effortful patience of a man who is accustomed to managing himself and finds being managed by others mildly challenging. She watched his jaw tighten when they assessed the side wound. She watched him answer their questions with single words and precise information and no embellishment. She watched him glance at her twice during the process, each time with the specific checking quality of his eyes from the doorway, the need to confirm, physically, that she was still there and still all right. She was still there. She thought about a small bag packed instead of a large one. She thought about a forest going quiet. She thought, "I always knew I was coming back." The drive back to the manor was long and dark and quiet. She sat beside him in the back seat of Devlin's vehicle. The healers had insisted he ride rather than drive, which he had agreed to with the specific minimal grace of a man, accepting a reasonable argument while finding the whole arrangement slightly undignified. She sat with her shoulder against his right shoulder, the uninjured side, and he did not shift it away, and she did not shift away, and they were both awake and both not sleeping, and both aware, with complete mutual knowledge that the other one was also awake and also not sleeping. The territory moved past them in the dark. The old trees, the narrowing road, the boundary markers appearing and disappearing in the headlights. The manor came into view ahead, every window lit, warm light pressing against the night the way it always did. The building looking like what it had always looked like, and what she had taken weeks to let herself see. Home, she thought. I packed the small bag. She thought, I always knew. He exhaled beside her. Slow and quiet, the exhale of a body doing the quiet work of healing and the separate work of settling, of the wolf and the man, finding their way back to the same equilibrium after an evening that had asked a great deal of both. She felt it move through her shoulder where they were touching. She did not move away, neither did he. The manor gates opened as they approached, and Devlin pulled through, and the gravel of the drive was loud under the wheels. And then they were stopped, and the door was opening, and the cold night air was coming in, and the manor was right there, lit and warm and waiting, and she stepped out into the night, and turned and waited, while the healers helped him out with the minimum of assistance he would accept. He straightened. He looked at her across the roof of the vehicle. His eyes were fully green. The wolf settled. The man present and clear and tired in the specific deep way of someone who has expended something real tonight and has not yet restocked it. She looked at him. She thought about everything she wanted to say and did not know yet how to say. The whole assembled weight of the last 11 days and the last 11 hours and the particular moment in a farmhouse doorway when he had crossed a room in 3 steps and put his hands on her face and asked if she was hurt. She would say it. She knew that now. Not tonight. Tonight was for warmth and healers and the quiet restoration of a body that had spent itself for her. But soon, in a room with a fire already burning, in the honest dark of a late night when there was nothing left between them but the true things. She thought. Soon, she said, "Come inside." He did. Chapter 9. Home. The manor was quieter than usual in the days that followed. Not empty. The pack moved through it with its ordinary rhythms. The staff came and went. In the mornings, Devlin managed the territorial fallout from the farmhouse incident with the focused, slightly grim efficiency of a man who has a great deal to clean up and prefers to do it without an audience. But there was a quality to the quiet that was different from the manor's usual settled stillness, careful, almost. Like a house that understood something was happening inside it and had decided collectively to give it room. Seraphine came the morning after they returned. She arrived in the kitchen while Lyra was making tea, and she sat at the table without being invited. And she looked at Lyra with those gold-brown eyes that saw everything, and she said, "How are you?" Not the social version of the question. The real one. "I don't know yet," Lyra said honestly. Seraphine nodded as if this was the correct answer. "That's the right place to be," she said. She accepted the cup of tea Lyra set in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around it, and she sat in companionable silence while Lyra made her own cup and stood at the counter and looked out the window at the winter garden. After a while, Seraphine said, "He asked about you this morning, before the healers would let him out of bed." Lyra looked at her cup. "I told him you were in the kitchen making tea," Seraphine said. "He stopped asking after that." She said it simply, without orchestration, without the arched eyebrow energy of someone delivering information they expect to land a certain way. Just a fact, the specific fact of a man who had needed to know where she was, and had stopped needing to know once he knew she was still here. Lyra wrapped her hands around her cup, the way Seraphine had wrapped hers, she thought. "He needed to know I was still here," she thought. "I am still here." She did not see him on the first day. The healers had established a recovery protocol that Devlin was enforcing with the diplomatic authority of someone who had long practiced managing an alpha, who believed that rest was a concept that applied to other people. She heard this from a distance. The occasional exchange of voices in the east corridor. Devlin's measured firmness. A single low response that she recognized and that told her he was awake and present and characteristically unconvinced by the idea of remaining horizontal. She did not go to him. She was not ready yet, not because she was still undecided. She was past that, had been past that, since a farmhouse doorway and a pair of silver eyes and 3 steps across a cold stone room. She was not ready because what she wanted to say required the right conditions, the right quiet, the right honesty. She was not going to say it while healers were in the corridor, and Devlin was managing logistics, and the manor was still processing last night's events. She would say it when it was just the two of them. She would say it when it was true, in the way that things are true at midnight, with no audience and no performance. And nothing between the words and the person they were meant for. So she spent the first day in the library. She read, though she could not afterward have said precisely what. She sat in the chair that had become hers. She noticed this, that she thought of it that way, hers, without the hesitation she might have expected. And she let the day move at its own pace, and she gave herself permission to simply be in the manor, without demanding that she know yet exactly what that meant. Devlin appeared in the library doorway mid-afternoon. He did not say anything. He looked at her with his pale gray eyes, and she looked at him, and the look he gave her was the specific look of a man who has been watching something develop over 2 weeks, with the patience of someone who had already concluded how it would end and is now in the phase of waiting for everyone else to catch up. He's asking where you are again, Devlin said. Tell him I'm in the library, she said. I did, Devlin said. He stopped asking. She looked back at her book. She heard very faintly the suggestion of a smile in Devlin's voice as he left. She saw him on the second day. He was in the corridor outside the study, standing with the careful, upright posture of someone whose side was still objecting to full extension, but who had decided that the corridor was a reasonable compromise between staying in bed and doing what he actually wanted to do. He was dressed. Dark wool, as always, the sleeve of his left arm hanging lower than usual in the unconscious accommodation of a shoulder that was healing on its own timeline. He looked up when she came around the corner. They stopped. The corridor was narrow enough that there was no version of this encounter that involved distance. They were close. Closer than they had been outside the charged circumstances of last night. Close in the ordinary daylight way of two people in a hallway who have not yet decided what to do with each other. She looked at his shoulder. How is it? Functional, he said. That's not what I asked. A pause. The jaw muscle, the tell. It's healing, he said. The side is slower. She nodded. She looked at his face, at the tiredness still visible beneath the surface, the specific tiredness of a body doing significant repair work, the kind that can't be rushed and requires an honesty about limits that she suspected he found challenging. You should be resting, she said. I'm standing in a corridor, he said. That's not resting. It's not resting. She looked at him. Something moved in her chest, warm and involuntary and entirely unwilling to be managed. That's not a sentence, she said. The exhale through his nose. Almost a laugh. The thing she had catalogued and anticipated and waited for without admitting she was waiting for it. Go back to your room, she said quietly. I'll come tonight. He looked at her. She held his gaze and let him see that she meant it. Let him see past the surface of the words to the thing beneath them. The thing she was going to say tonight in the right, quiet with the right, honesty. The thing that had been assembling itself inside her since a farmhouse doorway, and perhaps, if she was truthful, since a lodge window and a reflection in the glass. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. He was past surprise with her, she thought. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just been told, without words, that the patience is about to be met. He went back to his room. She did not go at midnight exactly. She went when the manor was fully quiet, when the last of the staff sounds had faded and Devlin's light under his door had gone out, and the old house had settled into its deepest nighttime rhythm, the specific quality of stillness that belongs only to large old buildings in the small hours when everyone in them has finally stopped moving. She went in her ordinary clothes. She did not prepare anything to say. She had learned in the last 2 weeks that the most important things she had said in this house had come out unplanned, had arrived from somewhere beneath the level of preparation, assembled by a part of her that was more honest than the part that rehearsed. She trusted that part. She was going to let it speak. His door was not locked. She had anticipated it to be. She opened it and went in. The fire was burning. Course it was. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The warm, steady fire in the grate, the room lit in the amber and gold of it, the specific quality of light that this room had in the evenings, that she had never been in before, but that looked exactly like every other room she had been in at the manor, lit with the same care, the same quiet attention to warmth. He was awake. He was in the chair by the fire rather than in the bed. She registered this as the specific compromise of a man who had agreed to rest and had interpreted that agreement as broadly as possible. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees, and his head slightly down, and his eyes on the fire, and he looked up when she came in with the unhurried attention of someone who had been expecting her and was simply waiting to see how she arrived. She came in fully. She closed the door behind her. She did not take the other chair. She sat on the low bench beside the fire, closer to him than the chair would have placed her, close enough that the firelight reached both of them, close enough that the silence between them had a physical quality, a warmth that was not only the fire. He waited. She looked at the flames for a moment. She gathered not her words, but herself, the full, honest, undefended version that she had been rationing in this house since the first night, because it had felt too much to offer to a situation she didn't yet understand. She understood it now. "I'm afraid," she said it looking at the fire, and then she made herself look at him. Because the point of this conversation was the looking. "I need you to know that first," she said. "Everything I'm about to say, I'm saying it afraid. I'm not saying it because the bond requires it, or because my father's arrangement makes it necessary, or because I have nowhere else to go." She held his gaze. "I have somewhere else to go. I could go there. I could build something ordinary and safe, and I would be fine." He was very still, listening with his whole body the way he listened when something mattered. "I'm not going to," she said. "Not because of the bond, because of you, because of 11 days of a man who lit a fire in my room before I arrived and arranged my sister's letters before I asked and sat in a hallway at 3 in the morning. Because his wolf knew I was afraid." She stopped. "Because of a man who came to a farmhouse," she said quietly, "when he didn't have to." "I had to," he said. "You know what I mean," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know what you mean," she breathed. "I'm choosing this. I want you to understand the difference between choosing and being arranged into. I was arranged into this house. I am choosing to stay in it." He looked at her for a long moment, the full, unmanaged, green-eyed look that she had first seen in a snowbound lodge and had been undone by ever since. Then he said, "I've been afraid since the night you arrived." She looked at him. "You didn't show it." "I showed all of it," he said. "You were looking at the wrong things." She thought about the fireplace. She thought about the chessboard reset without being asked. She thought about the walk to the boundary where he had told her she was free to go, and the lodge kitchen where he had made room for her at the counter, and the relay conversation where he had listened to her read the political situation and had said "that's exactly right" with something in his voice that sounded, she understood now, like relief, like a man who had been managing everything alone for a very long time and had just discovered he didn't have to. "I wasn't," she said softly. "I was looking at exactly the right things." Something moved in his face, slow and deep, the movement of something tectonic, the shift that happens when a weight that has been held in place for a very long time is finally allowed to set down. She watched it happen. She did not look away. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me," she said. He leaned forward slightly. The firelight moved across his face, and she watched the careful man, the controlled, managed, wall-up man she had met at the top of the entrance steps 11 days ago. Let the wall down, not partially, not in the selective and momentary way she had seen before, all the way. The full and complete lowering of it, the surrender of the control as a deliberate act rather than an accidental one. "The first moment," he said, "when you walked into the hall, my wolf went quiet." He held her gaze. Not still, quiet, the way a thing goes quiet when it has found what it was looking for and can stop searching. A pause. I have never told anyone that. She felt it move through her, warm and certain and devastating in the best possible way. It terrified me, he said. I had decided, a long time ago, that this was not something I was going to have, that I had given it up when Ewan died, that I had forfeited it, somehow, by not being fast enough, by not resolving the conflict before it cost him. His jaw, the tell. I had made my peace with that. That's not peace, she said quietly. That's punishment. He looked at her. Deciding you don't get something good because something bad happened, she said. That's not peace. That's a sentence you gave yourself. He was very still. You didn't fail him, she said. I don't know the full story, and I'm not asking for it tonight. But I know that a man who would cross a forest for someone he's known 11 days is not a man who failed his brother through indifference. She held his gaze. You are allowed to stop punishing yourself. The fire settled. The manor breathed around them. He exhaled, slow and long, and from somewhere deep, the exhale evam releasing a breath he had been holding for 8 years. The specific sound of a pressure that has been structural for so long, that releasing it changes the shape of everything around it. She moved from the bench. She sat on the arm of his chair. Close, deliberately close, within the reach of his arm if he chose to use it. Within the warmth of him, within the specific atmosphere of him that she had been peripherally aware of since the first night and had been telling herself she wasn't aware of and was done pretending. I'm not good at this, she said. Being allowed, wanting something and believing I get to have it. She looked at the fire rather than at him, because this part was harder. I've spent a long time being the least important person in the room. You stop expecting the room to rearrange itself for you. His hand came to her hand. Not a gesture. A fact. His hand covering hers, where it rested on the arm of the chair, large and warm and certain, the way he did everything. Without performance, without announcement. Simply the thing happening because it was the right thing to happen. She looked at their hands. I've never been the most important person in anyone's room, she said quietly. You've been the most important person in every room you've been in since you arrived here, he said. You simply weren't looking at the right things. She looked up at him. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her. Since the first night, she understood now. Not with the careful management she had read as distance, but with the full and complete and patient attention of a man who had decided in the first moment and had spent every moment since then simply waiting for her to be ready to see it. She was ready. I'm staying, she said. Not the bond, not the arrangement, not because you came to a farmhouse, though that mattered. That will always matter. She turned her hand over so her palm was against his. Because the fireplace was already burning. Because you reset the chessboard. Because you know I can't take comfort that asks me to perform receiving it. She breathed. Because you're the first person who has ever known what I needed before I knew I needed it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I've been making it up since you arrived. She stared at him. Every decision, he said. Everything I thought might help. The fireplace, the letters. I had no certainty it was right. I only knew what seemed like it might be what you needed. A pause. I was guessing. Based on you, based on watching you. She felt something open in her chest. Wide and warm and slightly helpless. You guessed correctly, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. I had good material, he said, and she laughed. It came out of her the same way it had in the lodge. Unguarded, genuine, the kind that starts in the chest before the brain has any say, warm and bright in the quiet room. And he smiled. Not the almost smile, not the exhale through the nose. A real one, slow and careful, like something being reopened that had been closed a long time, like a door in the sealed wing being gently, tentatively tried. It transformed his face. It took the angular, controlled, intimidating architecture of him and made it into something that was still all of those things, and also, simply and devastatingly, beautiful, she thought. There he is, she thought. That's the one I've been waiting to see. He pulled her toward him, one arm around her, careful of the shoulder, drawing her in from the arm of the chair to against him, and she went without resistance, without the need to negotiate the terms, without the low-level management of what it meant to let someone this close. She went because she wanted to, because she had chosen to, because the whole complicated, painful, extraordinary sequence of events that had brought her to this specific chair, in this specific room, on this specific night, had been, she understood now, not something that had happened to her. It was something she had walked into, one careful step at a time, with her eyes open. She settled against him and felt his arm around her, and the fire warm in front of them and the bond between them. The thing Seraphine had named, the thing that had been there since the first moment, the thing that had been patient and steady and entirely unhurried through every day of the last 11 days, settle. Not tighten. Settle. The difference between a chain and a root, something that had always been there, finding its way home. She woke in the chair. She had not meant to sleep, had not been aware of the transition, had simply been warm and held and deeply, fundamentally at rest. And then the quality of the light changed, and she understood she had been asleep for several hours, and it was now very early morning. The fire had burned to coals. His arm was still around her. She turned her head slightly and looked at the room. At the pale, early light beginning at the edges of the curtains, the amber gray of a winter dawn, the manor going from its deepest quiet to its first waking sounds, the far-off movement of the territory outside coming to life in the incremental way it did every morning. She thought about the drive to Thornveil 11 days ago. The rain, the narrowing roads, the trees getting older and darker and denser, closing overhead, the building at the end of the stone drive with every window lit from within, and a man at the top of the steps who was not what she had expected, and who had said her name once, quietly like a confirmation of something he had already known. She thought about 2 bags packed, about a ring left on a dresser, about a fireplace already burning in a room that had been prepared for her arrival. She thought about small bags and farmhouse doorways and reflections in lodge windows and chessboards, reset in the evenings and the sound of a log added to a fire at 3 in the morning, offered quietly in the only form she could have received it. She thought about a man who had decided in the first moment and had waited. She looked at the window, where the winter light was coming, in gray and gold and tender, the kind of light that belongs to early mornings in old houses in cold months, the kind of light that makes everything look like something that has survived and found itself still standing and is taking a quiet moment to register that fact. She felt him breathe. She felt the bond, steady and warm and entirely without demand, doing what it had always done, not pulling, not claiming, simply being present, the way the best things are present, the way the best people are present, quietly and consistently, and without requiring acknowledgement. She closed her eyes again for a moment, she thought. I came here expecting a cage, she thought. What I found was the first place that had ever felt like home. The manor breathed around her. The fire glowed in the grate. The territory outside was waking in its slow and ordinary way. Wolves and trees and old stone boundary markers, and the northern pass, and the chessboard in the library, and the sealed east wing that Was not yet ready but would be, she thought. Someday, when it was time. Outside, a bird called. The light strengthened at the curtain's edge. She stayed exactly where she was.